Hello, this is Jack Tutor of Attention Magazine. Welcome to Crucial Listening, the podcast where I speak with musicians and sound artists about 3 albums that are important to them. My guest this time is Kevin Martin, also known as The Bug. He releases music as Kevin Richard Martin. He's involved in Zonal, King, Midas Sound, Ladybug, formerly Techno Animal, Curse of the Golden Vampire, Ice, Razor X Productions. There's so much to Kevin's name. And it's evident in this conversation that Kevin breathes music, and yet his productions find a way to assimilate all this adoration and rebound it outward in something which is entirely his own, that doesn't just emulate what he loves, identifies the core sensations that result from the music that he vibes with, and projects that instead, not the surface aesthetics. I loved speaking with Kevin. It's so evident that you're speaking with someone who absolutely adores what he's talking about, and it's so infectious. And he's done a new soundtrack to Andrei Tarkovsky's film Solaris. It's being released as a standalone record, Return to Solaris, on Phantom Limb. And Kevin has this amazing relationship with space and his abilities of manipulating it within his music. So in The Bug, that's perhaps throttling space, making it quake, his heavy immersion in sound system culture being a key proponent of that. In his music as Kevin Richard Martin, this soundtrack included, he really makes space sprawl, and he leaves so much of it empty as well, so potently. On this soundtrack, I feel like the whole thing has this arc shape to it. It kind of clings to the perimeter and leaves this center palpably vacant. There's so much grittiness as well to this sound, perhaps due to a lot of the equipment that he was using in order to make this old Russian synthesizers. It's fabulous as a standalone listen. You can check it out at phantomlimblabel.bandcamp.com. Head over also to kevinrichardmartin.bandcamp.com for more releases, and thebugmusic.bandcamp.com. That's only a small slither of stuff you can check out with Kevin's name to it, but it's a good place to start. And as always, head to attentionmagazine.co.uk/crucial listening for more information on Kevin's picks. Thank you so much for listening. Your feedback is always really warming. I really love hearing from you. Great to know you're enjoying the podcast as much as I am. Without further ado, this is Kevin Martin on Crucial Listening. Hello, Kevin. Welcome to Crucial Listening.
Hey, Jack. It's good to speak to you.
Thanks for coming on. So we're here to talk about your 3 important albums that you've picked. Before we get to those, I want to talk about your new soundtrack for Tarkovsky's Solaris, retitled Return to Solaris, which is coming out on Phantom Limb. So you were asked, as I understand, to score a film of your choice by Boru Art Center, which is a massive question. And you went for Solaris. So firstly, what led to that choice to choose this film?
Well, actually, I gave them a list of 10 films. So
oh, right.
It wasn't just Solaris, but Solaris was 2 films in the running that it looked like they could get rights to, and the other one dropped out anyway. So it ended up just being Solaris, which when that news came to me, I was actually a little apprehensive because the original score is amazing, and I'm just so in awe of the movie anyway. And Artemyev's score was a bit daunting to follow, and then also you had Cliff Martinez's American remake, the Hollywood remake of Solaris, which a lot of people diss, but I think the score is incredible. And actually, I like the movie too, despite George Clooney. But yeah, so when it was confirmed that would be the film that I would go in on, as I said, I was pretty nervous, but excited. So it was a challenge, and instantly it was a case of, well, what can I try and do differently? How can I frame the score differently? What do I want from a score for Solaris? And it was the first time I'd been able to score to film, really, like literally have the movie running and be recording elements live to the movie, because the first film score I'd ever attempted as such was I tried to do a version of a film called The Conversation many years before. In fact, it was the first Bug release. And it's where I got the name The Bug, because it's all about a surveillance expert played by Gene Hackman, who goes mad because he ends up thinking he's been bugged by the CIA or FBI. I can't remember quite who he was working for. So in those days, I didn't have the technology. I literally had a video recorder that I was having to press rewind forward all the time, and making notes and just trying to get it right in my head. And then I tried to put my score to that movie, because at that time there was never a score available, and there was just Walter Murch's sound design in the film. I wasn't even aware that there was a film score until a couple of years ago, when Boomcat suddenly started selling the score to The Conversation. So for me, it was a revelation to be able to work with the movie as the movie's, running through, and to being able to literally play live alongside the movie with the technology that's available now. So that's a very long-winded answer, by the way, Jack.
That's a great answer. I mean, also as part of this as well, it sounded like that you wanted to hunt out equipment that would pay homage to the film's era and origin. I'm intrigued as to where that search took you.
Oh, that's just me being a gear slut, to be honest. And obsessed by technology, music technology. And I'd already had equipment by this Russian manufacturer called Soma before, which I was a big fan of. So for me, I'd been tracking this new piece of equipment that they'd come with, called a pulsar, which is a drum machine. I'd had a synthesizer called the Lyra before, which I was already besotted by, because it sounded very antiquated. It didn't sound modern in any way, and it wasn't played like how do you say it? It wasn't played like normal synthesizers. And the company generally, called Soma, have very unusual design practices and come up with items that are really quite revelatory and original. They're a maverick company, really, which attracted me to them. And yeah, when I'd been looking at this drum machine called a Pulsar that they just announced around the time it was confirmed I would do the score, and it felt like a good excuse to go for it and pull the trigger on one of those, knowing that it made sense to me that this Russian movie should have a Russian drum machine that sounds like it was made in the 70s, the machinery itself. And despite the fact it's a drum machine, I didn't use it as a drum machine. I used it as a tone generator, really. And yeah, it was just fortuitous that I was able to track it down, contact the company, and use it for the score itself. Because I was sort of determined the score shouldn't sound modern. It made no sense to me. It wasn't like I was scoring a new version of Solaris.
No.
I was basically scoring the original Solaris. So anything that sounded ultra modern on top just sounded wrong to me. So I wanted it to sound like the score had been made in the 70s,
So obviously I've only heard this in isolation, but there is such a wonderful sense of carving out space within this score where obviously I guess you have other sound, diegetic sound taking place within the film that this is supposed to embrace and hang round the edges of. Given that this is your first soundtrack proper, how did you find that process of generating space for other elements that you're not bringing to the table?
Well, luckily I was able to get them to send me a copy of the film that the original music had been taken away from.
Thank God, yeah.
So that was joy.
Yeah.
And I guess anyone that's a fan of Tarkovsky is aware how he paces his films. You know, they're the classic ultra slow art film. And again, for me, the film generally exists at such a strung out pace, and how it moves is fairly undynamic, apart from certain key scenes. So it was just a case of synchronizing my mind and my compositional style to the film, you know, and it wasn't a hard ask as such, because I'd already made music in that manner before, you know, with Techno Animal. We did an album called Re-Entry, and disc 2 of Re-Entry was music made as imaginary film scores and very long strung out pieces. And the first Techno Animal album had very long strung out instrumental pieces that were arrhythmic. Maybe for people who know me only as the Bug, it would seem like a radical shift. But the whole point for me of doing Return to Solaris and accepting the invite was because for a few years I'd had my mind set anyway on trying harder to get work with film scores or sound design or areas outside of clubs, because for a good few years I knew that the music industry generally has a vested interest in making caricatures out of people, you know, and you can only be seen as one thing, you know, really, to a large extent. And that's not me, you know. My tastes are wide and I like extremes. So for me, it's always crucial to stay ahead of your sell by date, you know, and try not to become a cartoon figure, or in terms of predictability or how media outlets will portray you. And I think that it's been very, very much at the forefront of my mind that I wanted to work on a film score. So it was just totally fortuitous that Wouter Voiroit approached to ask if I'd be interested, you know, and I was over the moon.
And you performed the score, right, back in October?
That's right.
Yeah. How was that?
Surreal as fuck. Sorry if I swear. I tend to swear quite often. Okay. Yeah, it was extremely surreal, you know, because it was the only show I played after lockdown last year, and the audience were all in masks. Yeah. And so, well, to be honest, actually, they weren't that socially distanced. So I was a bit nervous about that, really, because they just seemed to pack the people in the venue. But it was an extraordinarily beautiful venue. You know, it's a massive old Art Deco cinema, and the screen size was massive. So for spectacle, it was amazing, you know. And Wouter and his team in Ghent at the venue were so pro and on point and so enthusiastic about the whole project that it made me relax into it more. But it was a bit daunting as well, because new friends that I'd made in Brussels were all coming to the show, and I prefer to play shows where I don't know anyone in the audience. It makes me less nervous.
Yeah, totally.
So that was a bit inhibiting in a way, but cool, because the reaction was really nice. But just very strange to be playing shows again, you know. The last show I'd done, literally about a week or two before lockdown, probably in late February, had been a performance of Sirens in Copenhagen. And it was so horrendous, the whole atmosphere at the time, because at that time, I think literally midnight on the night of the show, the Danish government said they were shutting everything down immediately.
Wow.
And the warning sign was already in place on our way there. And I don't think I'd ever washed my hands so much in my life, or used so much disinfectant in my life. Me and my sound man were just behaving like paranoid neurotics. And it was just a really unreal atmosphere. And Sirens is a very intense performance anyway. And then to not play any shows at all until this one was sort of bringing a multitude of different emotions, you know, like excitement in one side, absolute nerves at another side, terror, having to play to a film score, to a movie that I'd never done before. Just loads of different emotions, but luckily it went super well, and shows were sold out. The audience reaction was amazing. The main review that I saw was fantastic, and it galvanized the idea of making it into an album.
Brilliant. Yeah, the score is gorgeous. I really encourage people to check it out, even in isolation. That's absolutely lovely. Kevin, we should talk about your 3 important albums, and one question I like to ask before we go into the actual records themselves is how you thought about the word important when you made your selection. I mean, I know we had a quick discussion between us, in fact, over email prior to coming on this show about the records you're going to pick, but was there a particular way that you thought about the word important to come up with the list of records that you did?
Music is crucial, full stop, for me. So the idea of it being important, of course, every major record that's made me swerve, you know, what's that, has had impact on me, because I basically devoted my life to music, you know, and a child of music. So to have to narrow it down to 3 was probably
so sorry.
You know, it was like, oh my God, 3 special albums. And ironically, the Quietus look like they're interested in me doing something similar. And that's sort of painful. I mean, it follows my social media outlets. Like on Instagram, I put an album of the day every day, and I have done since lockdown, just because it was important for me to stay passionate about music. And I hoped that it might have a knock-on effect for other people whilst we were all questioning, you know, life, reality, everything. It was important for me to stay connected with music. So, you know, I made a point of listening to an album at least every day, because in recent years, I think I hadn't so much. Mm-hmm. Just been so wrapped up in my own music. So, yeah, I mean, I'm veering away from your question, which is, of course, when you said you wanted me to talk about 3 important albums to me, I thought it would be fun to link them to 3 different areas that I've worked in, you know. So one I linked to the Bug, another I linked to the Solaris score, and another I linked to, you know, my birth as Kevin Richard Martin in the last year and a half.
Awesome. Well, I'll let you pick which one we go to first. Which one do you want to talk about?
I guess because we've been talking about Solaris, it would make sense to talk about the Andromeda Strain.
Yeah.
Because it's a science fiction soundtrack made in, I think, 1971, I believe. The guy's name who composed it, I'm probably going to totally mispronounce, but it's called Gil Mel, or Gilles Mele. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name, who I believe was a jazz composer and had been writing TV series when he was approached to do the score for this bleak dystopian science fiction film.
Yeah. Do you remember how you first came into it?
Well, I remember since being a very, very young boy, my mum was obsessed with science fiction movies and series. So I've been like gobbling up and consuming sci-fi since I was a kid, literally.
So cool.
Like my mum was obsessed by the original Star Trek, so I've been watching that every week. And the Andromeda Strain was just one of those films that I must have seen, Jesus, when I was probably 20 or something, the first time, or probably on Channel 4 or something. I can't remember the first time I saw the film. And at the time I saw the film, in all honesty, I probably didn't give a flying F word about the score, you know. I was just like finding the film itself pretty mesmerizing. And the irony is, the film is about a virus. And, you know, the uncontrollability of a virus. In the film, it's basically around the idea of an alien virus, but things like quarantine, you know, and disinformation are rife in the film, and it's just a paranoid feast of a film, you know. So it's sort of fitting for the last year and a half we've all suffered globally, you know. But the score itself, if I remember rightly, it was probably a member of God, my first band, that lent me the film soundtrack. I think it was Gary Jeff, the bass player in God, that lent it to me. I could be wrong. I know it was somebody that lent it to me. And the artwork is just astonishing. So it was a limited edition version, which unfortunately I've never been able to track down at a reasonable price. It's like a folding hexagonal sleeve made out of silver board. And straight away, as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, I'm going to love this. However it sounds, I'm going to love this score. And he knew the stuff I was into when he suggested I might like it. And that would have been like, 15, 20 years ago, I guess, that he lent me the album. And I was just blown away because it sounded so futuristic and sounded so completely out there and not what you'd expect from a film score, you know, unless you've already well grounded in the history of composition of film, you know, which I wasn't at that time. I am now. And I was just astounded that could have been made into a major movie in Hollywood, you know. And I subsequently read, I think if I remember rightly, the director was really hardcore, and I can't remember the film director's name, but he was very hardcore in specifying that he didn't want a conventional score. He wanted to use a score that was atonal, experimental. And if I remember rightly, I think there was a synthesizer actually developed for the film and invented for the film score, but directly. So again, it's a sort of, you know, it's a testament to that time, you know. And I think, considering it was made in 1971, even if I listened to it over the weekend when I knew we were going to talk, just to remind myself of the score. And it's still astonishing. You know, it sounds like Orteca 1 minute.
Yes.
It sounds like Mika Levy the next minute. It sounds like dub music concrete. And it's a short score. It's about 30 minutes or something, you know. But just, you don't get bored for I certainly don't get bored for 1 second. I mean, it's not easy listening, you know, and it's certainly experimental, but astonishing for me personally.
Yeah, I read about this one, and what you say is Robert Wise, I think the director's
Oh, that's correct.
name.
Yeah. It's him. Yeah.
And the quote that I took down that you referred to there was that he wanted Jill to write music that had no themes, no chords, no harmonic structure, with totally new sonorities.
Right.
Holy moly, I mean, what a demand!
Yeah, mental.
And are there any particular, I mean, because there are so many gorgeous textures on this score, it's a really jagged thing. Are there any particular moments that really protrude to you, that really make your ears prick up when you listen?
I'll be honest, I couldn't even tell you the song titles, because when I put it on, I just get immersed in it, and I don't want to think of it in any other sense than I'm being enveloped in an absolute sound world, and I think there's a sort of alien quality to it, and I don't mean in outer space aliens and spaceships, blah blah blah. I mean literally there's a core of it that's absolutely unknowable, me, and I keep going back to it for that reason. I think so much music I love, and we'll talk about Metal Box soon, for instance. There's a core to some of my favorite music which is forever fresh and forever sounds like, what the fuck, jaw on the floor, what is this?
Yeah.
And that's very true of Andromeda Strain for me, and just the way it segues from passage to passage. I think at that time, when you think 1971, in parallel you would have all those amazing jazz albums, Miles Davis leading the charge into the studio with Teo Macero.
Yeah.
You would have dub revolutionaries like Lee Perry or King Tubby going crazy in studios there. So it was a good time, I think, probably for people being creative with new technology to find ways to mutate and fuck with sound. I think that's exactly what Gil Mel did, and very unusually to get a director, a major film company, to push him further. Amazing.
Yes. Yeah,
really astonishing. He must have been laughing all the way to the bank.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that you put it alongside the context of, say, someone like Miles, where, I guess this was sort of around a bitch's brew sort of time, where he was like recontextualizing jazz in the context of the studio and saying, look, we can snip this and, put it in different places. I really feel like that Jill's status as a jazz musician comes through on this record hard, which is strange in amongst such textures, like these kind of electronic textures, to have what sometimes feels like a very fluid, jazzy, improvisatory energy also going through it. It's really, I mean, I'm saying this on the back of like 2 listens, but it's really peculiar. It's cool.
Yeah, I just think it, as I just mentioned, really, I think it's constantly morphing and shape-shifting in a way that the best music can do, really, and remains captivating from start to finish, which a lot of albums don't.
Yeah.
And a lot of albums don't age too well, whereas I think this still sounds like the future to me.
So let's talk about your second record then, Kevin. Which one do you want to go for now?
Okay, we're talking about jazz, so maybe we should talk about the Necks.
Yes.
And Necks. I was introduced to this album by a composer called Paul Schutzer, who at that time was a very good friend of mine, and introduced me to a lot of amazing music. And at the time, and this would have been, again, like 20 plus years ago, over 20 years ago. And he and I were huge fans of electric jazz, you know, that period from probably 1969 to 74, where a lot of astonishing jazz albums were made, you know, by the likes of Pharoah Sanders, Don Cherry, Alice Coltrane, you name it. Yeah. And he just happened to mention one day, you know, have you ever heard the Necks? And I was like, no. And he said, oh, I think you're going to really like the Necks. And just the way he said it, and he knew my taste pretty well anyway, I was like, yeah, hit me up. What does it sound like? And then he put it on, and within seconds I was hooked. And for anyone that hasn't heard the record, it's just one long continuous track, start to finish, which, you know, at flat rate, you're like, well, nothing's changed. You know, it feels like an eternal bass line, which is exactly the sort of bass line I love anyway, that sort of ostinato, repetitive, you know, heartbeat swing. But the beauty of the Necks for me is how it's sort of revolutionary in how subtly their evolutions shift, whereby what you think you started with has suddenly become something quite different by the end, but you're not aware how, because it still feels somehow the same relationship from start to finish, but something's changed.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, and I think they're magicians. Literally, I became obsessed by the Necks, and they've become really literally one of my favorite bands, if you like. And the first time I saw them, if I remember rightly, I was very eager to see them, having become besotted by their recordings. And the first time I saw them, I seem to remember, was Islington Chapel, which was an amazing location to see them. And I distinctly remember being so blown away by the show that as they walked off stage, I unselfconsciously and sneakily tried to make my way to the stage whilst everyone else was leaving the venue to find out what effects they'd been using. Because some of the sounds that they were generating sounded so completely synthetic and otherworldly. Uh-huh. That there was not one single pedal or effect or anything additional on stage. They just generated all those incredible sounds from a double bass, a drum kit, and a piano. And that astounded me, because I'm not a fool, and my ear's fairly well tuned. And to feel that I'd been totally bewitched and sort of disorientated enough to think, wow, what are those electronics they're using? And then finding out they hadn't been using any was astounding, you know, like literally astounding. And every time I've seen them subsequently, they just never fail. Actually, It's quite shocking. You know, you'll go and see a band where if you see a band quite regularly, you'll start getting a bit bored, or you'll think that they just fall into tricks. Mm-hmm. Their improvisational skills are astounding. And I have to say, I fell out of love with a lot of improvisational music when I was living in London, because I felt that I'd be going to performances where I'd be not waiting, but the performances would be 20% or 30% successful. Obviously, I can name a few major artists that can go beyond that, you know. Mm-hmm. I remember seeing Cecil Taylor. I remember seeing AMM, both of which were mind-blowing. But I would go to a lot of improv shows and find that you'd just be waiting for the good parts.
Yeah,
And
totally.
also, what you thought was improvised, if you started seeing the same performers over and over again, you suddenly thought, well, actually, this isn't improvised, or not what my thought of improvisation was, because they're doing the same thing they did in the last 3 shows, more or less, a slight variation. But the Necks literally do improvise every show, and every show sounds different, much like their albums. They go, one minute they'll go from sounding like some epic Morricone score to the next minute they'll sound like, that the artist Tortoise would want to be, to the next minute sounding like epic ambient music, etc., and just, totally bewitching and extraordinary. Even talking about them still now, I'm just like amazed at how good they are as musicians. And, I think that's the thing. A lot of people who are into jazz or who are into rock music can tend to get blinded and worship technique. Technique's never been the issue for me. That's not my God, and not what I look for in music. If anything, I like things that are a bit wonky and off. But what I like and love about the Necks is they obviously are technically gifted, but it's not about being showy with technique. It's about capturing an atmosphere or a state of mind and just hypnotizing you. And for me, that's what Sex does as an album.
Is it one that you put on often since you first discovered it?
Regular. Slade. I could not remember how many times I've had that one on. And what's interesting again for me as a complete obsessive to studio technology is they very obviously used studio technology on the album Sex. It's not pretending to be a live album. There's overdubs and effects throughout, but it doesn't diminish the mood. It doesn't feel tricksy. It just enhances the playing and enhances the listening experience.
Yeah, I'd totally forgotten that they had overdubs on this record, because I think it's probably been about 8 years since I played this one. But I think it just gets burned into your head as a totally organic live record, probably because the most protrusive element is the dynamic between them rather than the studio in between them, Yeah,
and also if you're hooked, I don't know where your interest lies in them or in jazz, but if you were hooked on trying to find jazz albums that were as minimal as In a Silent Way, for instance, and weren't, as far as I'm concerned, spoiled by excessive soloing, the Necks are like the Holy Grail.
Yeah, totally.
Because it's like, okay, I don't have to put up with the showy technical virtuosity in my face. I can just zone to the spirituality of the music or the atmosphere of the music without anything getting in the way of that. And just be completely seduced by the swing, and the grooves. They have so much going for them, on various albums. They can 1 minute or one release by release be very atonal. The next minute they can have like more freer grooves or very percussive based grooves. Next release you can listen to them and it just sounds more like more conventional jazz.
Yeah.
It's just every album is surprising, and of course what the ingredients are, but that's also the beauty of it. It's like how they can keep evolving and shape-shifting album by album. Like the latest album sounded like Can in places.
Yes, yeah.
And more krautrocky, so Yeah, great band, extraordinary band.
Yeah. I get nervous for them every time I see them play because I'm like, they've got, as you say, they go from scratch and someone's got to do the first thing.
It's shocking, isn't it? Just how they appear so composed
Yes.
in what they do. I don't see any sign of nerves when I see them play, or any sign of jitters or faulty playing on any of the show. And I don't know how many times I've seen them now. Probably at least 10 times.
Yeah. You couldn't play this music, I don't think, if you had any stiffness or reservation. They're like water, especially with Chris on the piano. It's just a cascade.
I agree. And I think they're so completely besotted by what they do and passionate about what they do. The genuine honesty of the music shines through.
I've seen you mention about, and this may have actually been in reference to a totally different record, and I'm probably going to misquote you as well, so this is going well already, but that you have a present interest or a recent interest in moving towards something more super reductive and minimal, which feels in parallel with what the Next do on sex, especially.
Because I haven't. Yeah, of course, I haven't put this into a context of why I chose them. Yeah, I mean, in a way, the Frequencies for Leaving Earth series that I composed and mixed down in lockdown situation in our new home of Brussels had, in my mind's eye, it was the idea of putting together a series of recordings that somehow exist in some fictitious border of, glacial ambient jazz, elusive film scores, and deep spiritual drone music, and when I worked on those records in our new home city, it was really as a monastic experience because it felt like the world was falling apart last year.
Yeah.
And it was like to try and stay sane. If you're responsible for generating the cash for your family, 2 young kids, and you're seeing your livelihood disappear through the collapse of live shows, you're just thinking, well, what do I do here? I sink or I swim, and it was like, I'm not going to let myself go mad. I'll try. And I'm going to direct my energy into a series of albums that I already thought about the year before anyway, and started working on a long distance flight from Berlin to Brazil. And the whole concept and name of Frequencies for Leaving Earth had come to mind the year before, and it felt like the perfect time to work on it last year. And I knew that the albums, by and large, I wanted to defy dynamics, to evolve so slowly and subtly, but increase in intensity under the surface that obviously echoes how someone like the Next compose, I suppose. But whereas they improvise freshly each time, I wasn't. I was more interested in texture and tonality and continuing to stretch what my studio is capable of and my chosen tools within the studio.
I mean, I've seen you talk about the fact that you're a fan of Eliane Radigue as well, which feels apt to also mention there, because I feel like she was on a similar jag.
Yeah, she's incredible, absolutely incredible, And also I think when I started working on Kevin Richard Martin stuff in earnest last year, I mean, obviously I'd already released Sirens on Lawrence English's Room 40 label a year or two before. When I really got stuck in last year to what it was I was after. It was very much how solo can solo be, without putting anything else in the way of what I wanted to create, zero compromise, zero thought about any label, zero thought about any other performers, zero thought about any responsive or non-responsive opinions in return. I just knew I had to make this music, and I wanted it to try and find a fresh, clear spot that people would see as being a fresh sound. It's very difficult because when you're working in areas where there's been such incredible recordings and players and composers, to find your own voice, I've talked about this before, is the bug with electronic music, is a huge challenge, and I just wanted to make music that reflected my personality, and reflected what I was trying to locate that I couldn't elsewhere. I think so often when I make music, I'm trying to make something that I'm not hearing anywhere else, that I don't feel exists or I can't find. Therefore, it's like, oh, well, fuck it. If I can't find it, I'm going to do it myself, or at least attempt to, even if it's going to be a complete folly and I fail in the process. At least I'm going to try it, And I think that's what last year was about for me, really.
Also, as well, I wanted to mention you released a couple of days back, as we're talking, Bedroom Loops, which you noted, I think, was it recorded or created horizontally and designed for listening to horizontally. How did you make it when you say so? Is it made in your bedroom? I was intrigued just by the description.
On the laptop, just like laying on the pillow with another pillow on my knees with the laptop leaning on it, just composing the skeletal beginnings of each track. I just set myself a goal that in 7 days I'd come up with 7 sketches. And knowing roughly what it would be that I would be looking for mood-wise and sonically, but being able to, detour from that. The only limitation I set myself, if you can call it a limitation, because in a way it's sort of endless in itself, is that I only wanted to work with granular synthesis, because I'd been working on and off with granular synthesis and sampling for, the last year or two. And I'd found it to be like some of the freshest sonic inspiration that my ears had heard. And it's ironic because despite having composed all components on either granular synthesizers, both software and hardware, on granular effects and granular samplers, the biggest irony of all is it ends up sounding like the Kevin Richards albums that came out last year, even with these other tools, But so, it's interesting because some of the feedback I've seen in the last couple of days, some people have noticed that there is a difference, and I think there's a colder, more openly sci-fi impact of granular sound sources, literally sort of alien. And for me, I wanted to sort of melt those down a little and bring them to my world and make granular sound warm, and try not, when you work and experiment with granular synthesis, you realize you've heard a lot of the sounds, before.
Right.
And how can you, maneuver it to find some fresh zone that doesn't just sound like typical granular experimentation.
So let's talk about your final important record, Kevin. So yeah, if you could give me the name of it and then a bit of an introduction as to why it's important to you.
Yeah, well, this one was in terms of the bug, but actually really just in terms of me musically, full stop, because it was also an inspiration for my first band, God, a vital one. And it's an album by Public Image Limited, which initially was called Metal Box, or was known as Metal Box, because it came in a film can, literally a metal box, circular metal box, and then became known as Second Edition. And I was so young when it came out that I didn't have the money to be able to afford the metal box, and a mate of mine did, and he just taped it for me. Piracy, killing music and all that. And it was just a few years later when I picked it up myself, and I've ended up rebuying it several times over the years in one format or another. And it still scares me as an album now, as much as it did the first time I heard it. Like we were discussing earlier. Just that, what the hell? This, I mean, one of the first things that very vivid memories of for me musically in my life was a school friend of mine. I can't even remember how young I was. I must have been outrageously young at the time, playing me Nevermind the Bollocks off a cassette that he'd got. And he must have been like 9 at the time when he had it.
Wow.
I was just nervous giggling about it, was swearing, which I've never recovered from. Obviously, it had an impact. And the first music that really touched me as a kid, like my mum had bought me records before, of course, because she wanted those records, but thought I would want them. Mm-hmm. But when it came to me purchasing music, the first 7-inch I ever bought was by Discharge. I think the first album I ever bought was by The Damned. And it was punk music, just because my childhood wasn't very happy. It was a broken home, a broken up, busted up family with a father who was a complete asshole, wife beater, child beater, you name it. And punk music addressed the chaos that was in my life and felt revolutionary, and felt exciting and felt to a very, very young boy like an escape, a way out. And the Sex Pistols, I was too young to really know about musically. I mean, I knew about them, of course. As I told you, I heard them. And of course, my parents would be dissing the shit out of the Sex Pistols all the time. People of their generation were shit scared of the Sex Pistols, what they represented, as well as so many people in the country at that time, which made it all the more attractive to me, Mm-hmm. It was when I heard Public Image Limited after John Lydon had dashed off the Pistols, and when he released his first single, I just remember goosebumps when I heard the first single, just being completely mind blown, not having heard anything like it in my life at that time. And it was that wave of what is now labeled post-punk, I guess, where there was so many artists that really inspired me to actually want to make music, as a very, very young kid, and that just Killing Joke, Joy Division, ending up, with things like The Birthday Party, but things like Throbbing Gristle, Crass, were major, major, major influences on me as a young kid, and Metal Box in particular. What struck me about Metal Box was my lifeline at the time. I mean, you and I were discussing growing up in, the south of England, and mm-hmm. I was in. My lifeline was John Peel, because I didn't have much money because I was so young, right. And also I couldn't travel to many shows because growing up in Weymouth, there weren't that many shows that local, or the ones that you could afford to go to, or even that my parents would let me go to because I was so young. So I'd be tuning into John Peel's radio show, and he would have mad-ass sessions by incredible musicians. And in particular, he would be mixing different styles. So he'd play Captain Beefheart next to free jazz, next to the Fall, next to reggae, and growing up in Weymouth at that time, Weymouth is just whiter than white,
Yeah.
like really just monoculture. And the only time if it wasn't, it'd normally be from sailors or holiday makers in the summer coming from whichever parts of the country down to Weymouth for vacation. So the idea of me gravitating towards reggae, on one hand, that wouldn't make a lot of sense, but Peel playing reggae made a lot of sense to me. And also, as a very young kid, I always hung out with older dudes than me who were my educators, so they'd be hitting me up with reggae and dub. And at the same time, I'd be listening to Killing Joke, where you've got youth playing reggae basslines, and Public Image Limited, or The Stranglers, where Jean-Jacques Brunel was playing reggae basslines. And I think it's even been now mentioned somewhere, or someone mentioned to me in recent years, that also Peter Hook talking about how Joy Division were obsessed by dub and reggae too, which I didn't know at the time.
Huh.
So you got a lot of bands who were being led by the bass in the same way reggae was, as far as I was concerned, because I sort of gravitated towards dub because it reduced everything down to very minimal elements and mad effects and psychedelia. And all this roundabout way of me leading back to Metal Box is Jar Wobble was just a king of bastardizing reggae bass lines, and coming up with insanely irresistible grooves, and I believe he even wrote drum parts for Metal Box. And the album's just extraordinary, in so many ways, and still so many ways to me, because it uses a lot of dub mixing in a really great way, but it's got a very live feel to lots of the tracks, and I read, obviously, like Lydon felt that he thought the Pistols were too rock and roll and he wanted to break free of that. And the first Pill album's even more venomous, I think, and more brutal, but there's something about second edition. I mean, it's a toss-up for me that second edition just wins out, because I loved the first album too. But second edition, basically, it just felt like a great big ball of anger and frustration and sociopathic hate, but not in a cartoon way like elements of the Sex Pistols did. It just felt sinister and nasty and neurotic and deeply, deeply paranoid, and that's probably how I was feeling at that time.
Right.
And it still has an edge for me that is really cutting, in so many ways, whether it be lyrically, vocally, sonically, with Keith Levine's extraordinary guitar playing. Just so much going for it. I think the world's still to catch up with Metal Box. In fact, I remember saying in an interview a couple of years ago that my vision for London Zoo was probably to make my version of Metal Box.
Wow.
In as much as I wanted to bring together disparate styles, and feed on the friction of doing that, not trying to, dilute anything. If anything, just try and get everything on fire. And also just trying to capture an atmosphere of a time and place, and lead with the bass. I haven't got a lot of time. When people go on about bass music, as if to say that, we do bass music's important, bass music this, bass music that, leaves me very cold, to be honest. It's a bit like saying, well, I do guitar music or I do sax music.
Yeah.
I don't give a shit about in one way, I don't give a shit about what makes the music. It's about why you make the music.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to say that there's something about bass that has magnetized me, but it's certainly not in any way the be-all or end-all of what I do or care about. But I know personally I love bass lines. It's a bit contradictory. But it's just, like I said, when I see this marketing of bass music and people just trying to hype themselves up as if bass is important. Well, actually, John Lydon's lyrics are more important on Metal Box in a way, and his approach. And Levine's style of guitar playing is more radical than Wobble's bass playing. And those things catch me on a different day, and I'll be like, actually, they're more important, and they're what that smack it, more than Wobble's playing. But I guess it's just that combination of all the elements in there, and it's not just about one element. It's not just about bass, you know. So, yeah, Metal Box, love it.
Have you seen Public Image play live?
No, actually. I mean, that's the thing. When you grew up in Weymouth, I missed out. There's a lot. I remember speaking to Nick Bullen, who was one of the original members of Napalm Death and original members of Scorn recently on Facebook, I think it was, where he was mentioning the shows he'd seen. And I was so envious because there was so many great bands that I wish I'd got the chance to see, that because I was just stuck in Weymouth, it was just impossible. At a time where a lot of the music that really inspired me, I would love to have seen. I mean, obviously, as soon as I moved to London, Jesus, I saw so much music, at the time, and that was my lifeblood, and that was my apprenticeship, and that was my reason for living, was the music that pulsed through London's arteries, and at the same time, I was just deeply envious when I was a kid. When I'd look at the lineups, I'd be reading all the music papers and seeing, these extraordinary lineups in London. And that's certainly one of the reasons I moved to London, because it was a dream location in my head, and I was naive in how I thought how easy it might be to go to London and get things rolling. It wasn't. It was an absolute nightmare, and at the same time, I just knew I wanted to go there because I wanted to see a lot of the music that I just couldn't access in Weymouth. I mean, Justin Broderick from Godflesh and, with me and Zonal and Techno Animal, grew up in Birmingham, and Birmingham was lucky because it was on that tour circuit. Mm-hmm. Weymouth wasn't. I seem to remember, but the only two good bands that I saw in Weymouth, one was the Blue Orchids and the other was Section 25. But apart from those, I'd be really scraping the bottom of the barrel to say the good stuff I saw. Or the League of Gentlemen were pretty good too.
I saw Napalm Death in Weymouth, actually.
Napalm Death?
Yeah, my wife supported them in her band.
Jeez.
But that's
actually, to be honest, I just had a big error, because actually the one thing in Weymouth that was good, and again really inspired me, because I used to go to all the shows and was learning to play music at that time too, was the punk thing, so I would see big local heroes then was a band called The Mob, who came from Yeovil, who ended up releasing stuff on Crass's label. And then you'd get bands like Amoebics and Disorder coming and playing in Weymouth quite often. And who else played down there? I think Zounds played down there. So actually that was good in Weymouth. Those anarcho bands that were very, very inspirational to me at that age were coming to Weymouth at that time. But in terms of Public Image Limited now, and by the time, Flowers of Romance had come out, they'd sort of imploded as a band anyway, really. I think Wobble left after second edition, didn't he?
Yes, yeah, that's right.
So I don't think there would have been anything I would have wanted to see after that, really. And as far as I can tell, the shows were pretty shambolic, from what I've been told. Maybe there were some great ones. But, yeah, no, I never got to see Pill.
I want to just bring up something you said as well about, I mean, you kind of answered it with London Zoo to an extent, but you mentioned that this music that was cropped together in post-punk made you want to start making music. I mean, do you remember your kind of first forays in trying to translate that desire to make music on the basis of hearing these records into actually making music yourself? What did that look like?
It was basically Roland SH-101 and saxophone and my voice. And a guy called Nigel Armstrong, who was a huge influence on me. He was older than me, and he welcomed my ideas and agreed to form a band with me in Weymouth. And it was a local youth club where we were allowed to rehearse in, and we were able to rehearse in. And it was about experimentation. It was just the great thing about all that music was it was so heavily experimental. And that was the whole point, as far as I could tell. And it was DIY. And those ethics combined with just a lot of punk philosophies were the perfect recipe for me for trying to, knuckle down to music and try and find my voice artistically through music. And, like 4-track Tascam recorder that Nigel had would be what we'd be recording onto, and then we'd just be bouncing tracks over and over again, for the endless amount of information we'd want to try and put in there. It all ended up just sounding flat and sort of horrible. And yeah, just trying to put on shows yourself or grab onto. I remember we played a show in Dorchester. We'd managed. There was a local dude who was a notorious drug dealer and hip social guy who decided that he thought we were the future of music. So he arranged to put on a show in Dorchester. Got literally coachloads of people to come to the show, and people from Dorchester coming to the show, and we were terrible.
Oh no!
It's like stunned lack of reaction or positivity from the audience. So a lot of trial and error, really, as you would when you're young. Trying to find your voice in sound, but at the same time being continuously inspired by every new thing you would hear. And there was also, very importantly for me, there was a record shop called Handsome Dick's that was run by a couple of guys who were probably in their 30s at that time, I guess, which seemed old then, who were really, really cool with young kids and turning us all on to great music, which is obviously in their interest because that means they sell music. But
right.
they were evangelical about their love of, Beefheart, Zappa, free jazz, you name it. But they had great taste, and it's where all the local alternative people would gather and hang. And that was really a big part of my education process, because it's so hard it's probably so hard for a lot of people to recognize now in the days of the internet. You take it for granted now how easy it is to access music on YouTube or Spotify or wherever you want to go. But at that time, you had to be dedicated to try and search out stuff, and I don't mean it was better then. It wasn't. It was a pain in the ass then.
Right, yeah.
But it would be very tough to get hold of music, and have access to music and gain knowledge. So I was very fortunate that there was a hub of people around this record shop that were very quick to gather me under their wing, and teach me that music didn't have to be shit. Music could be inspiring and different, and revel in its difference, and revel in being maverick and original and antagonistic and caustic.
I've heard some people talk about the fact that they grow up in somewhere slightly more remote that's starved of regular shows and having to sort of yearn for this stuff from afar. I think Melvins had that element about them. They came from the sticks, even maybe like De La Soul, right? Compared to some of the music coming out of the city, that suburban element gave them something different. Is there a sense
I think it helped me.
I was going to say.
I remember reading incredible reviews by a writer who was a big influence on me, called Deli Fidela, who, in fact, he was responsible for me buying the first Public Enemy album the week it came out, and he was also the one responsible, more or less, for getting me to listen to On You Sound, and
wow.
His reviews of On You Sound live shows were just so tantalizing and sounded so incredible. But because I think Adrian Sherwood had decided, to go in different directions, which I can totally understand, as we all do. You don't want to repeat yourself over and over ad infinitum. By the time I'd moved to London, I think I'd missed, the explosive Mark Stewart and the Mafia shows, or the incredible African Head Charge shows, the Kalani shows. But in a way, it's good that I did, because it meant I wanted that. And with the chaos of bug shows and, the intensity and atonality and the madness that I'd like to conjure sometimes at bug shows, in a way, it was trying to reproduce what I'd read in those reviews about shows I'd never attended.
Right.
So yeah, you're right. You're right. In a way, and as I said earlier, throughout my musical history, I've always tried to make music that I can't find anywhere else, or I can't hear, even if it's a juxtaposition or a willful contrast of things that shouldn't go together, So yeah, long way again of saying I agree with you.
I have one more question for you, Kevin, which is, you're listening to an album a day at the moment, and I'm sure you do plenty of other listening besides that as well, but when you really want to listen to a record and soak it up, is there a specific location or environment or whatever that you use in order to really do that?
Yeah, I've got to say that the irony and pain of the last year and a half is that actually touring was always optimum time for me to just immerse myself in my headphones. And as far back as I can remember, like when I was a horrible, ignorant little shit as a young kid and carrying a huge ghetto blaster through Weymouth, playing like punk tracks very loud when I walk past policemen, to the dawn of the Walkman, to the dawn of the iPod. My life's always been about getting lost in sound, and having a pair of headphones on, or when my parents used to argue like shit all the time and have all-out warfare, I would just literally grab the speakers off the bookcase, pull them down to the floor on either side of my head, and just ramp up the Discharge and Crass records.
Nice.
just to get those battles out of my ears, And I think touring is the place where, certainly for me, just being on planes or being on trains or going from A to B and looking for a soundtrack for that. And like I said, Frequencies for Leaving Earth was composed on a long-distance flight to Brazil. But in terms of just having the time and space and lack of obstacles to losing yourself in what you're listening to, I always find the travel zones are the place to do it,
Mm-hmm.
And I think increasingly it's difficult for people now to play music loud at home because, unless you're very fortunate, we're all living in, well, not all, but so many people live in urban areas where you have neighbors who aren't going to be too happy about you playing Scientists and Roots rhythms. Like plus 20, so yeah, I guess that's the time, really. And it's a shame because I missed that in the last year and a half. That's one thing I miss about touring, is just locking into albums. And that was one of the reasons why I decided to start this little idea up of an album a day on Instagram.
Is there anything, before we wrap up, anything you want to mention, Kevin, that you got coming up in the imminent future that we haven't already touched on?
Oh, there are quite a lot, but nothing I'm actually allowed to speak about. But I'll say that I've finished the next Bug album, and Ninja Tune are going to release it, and I'm super happy with it.
Great.
And it's relentlessly uncompromising.
Wonderful. Great. Well, Kevin, thank you once again, and to everyone listening, I'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Yeah, brilliant, Jack. It's been big fun chatting with you.